August 6th and August 9th this year marked the 79th anniversary of the United States dropping atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This would be the first time nuclear weapons were used in armed conflict, but certainly not the last. During the Cold War, possession of large amounts of nuclear weapons gave the United States and the Soviet Union enormous power that, coupled with conventional strength, enabled them to divide the world into two poles. Mutually assured destruction meant that neither power would directly engage in a hot war, but would set their proxies against each other, bringing more instability. With the dawn of the multipolar era, more powers have obtained nuclear weapons and are continually on the track to obtain nuclear weapons. You're listening to Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose. I'm Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C. based security policy analyst and news reporter, bringing you timely analyses and commentary on issues in international relations, war, and security policy. Will nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction bring peace, as some claim? How does the use of nuclear weapons fit in with international humanitarian law? What does U.S. law say about when the U.S. could use nuclear weapons? Joining me today to answer these questions is Professor Charles Moxley of the Fordham School of Law. Moxley is the author of the book Nuclear Weapons in International Law: Existential Risks of Nuclear War and Deterrence Through a Legal Lens, Volumes 1 to 2. Charles J. Moxley Jr. is an experienced litigator, arbitrator, mediator, and law professor at Fordham Law. He has spent over 35 years as a litigator in large and complex commercial, securities, insurance, and other cases throughout the United States while teaching arbitration law and practice and international law, as well as litigation-related subjects including evidence, civil procedure, New York practice, and professional responsibility. He is a prolific analyst on nuclear weapons law, having taught the subject since the early 2000s. Moxley has also published numerous law review articles on the subject of nuclear weapons in international law, including in the Fordham International Law Journal. He has also spoken frequently on the subject at the United Nations, the New York City Bar Association, and the International Section of the American Bar Association. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm delighted to be here.
As tensions with Russia and China rise, there are concerns that these tensions would erupt into a nuclear war. What does the law here in the United States say about the use of nuclear weapons? Is it a hard and fast rule, as many assume, that the U.S. uses nuclear weapons solely for defensive purposes? Or does the law allow us to use these weapons for offensive cases?
This area, Andrew, of the law, and is particularly international law, that applies to the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons, this is a huge topic. The typewritten manuscript of my book reads 1,600 pages, so it's hard to summarize it, but there is indeed, and I think this is a threshold insight for all of us as we think about it. There is a body of law, international law, that applies to the use and the threat of use of nuclear weapons. And this is not an esoteric point or a controversial point in any way. It's acknowledged by the United States, by Russia, by China, by other nuclear weapons countries, that there is this body of law. And so, as you've asked in our preparatory discussions, what is this body of law? And I think people will find it interesting that the body of law that applies here is the body of international law, including particularly the law of armed conflict and other areas, that applies to conventional weapons generally, right? There are nuanced areas of international law that relate to nuclear weapons, but as a broad opening perspective on this discussion, the international law that applies to the threat and use of nuclear weapons is the same body of international law that applies to the use of conventional weapons. And this is a well-formulated body of law. It's set forth in a number of multinational conventions to which the United States and other nuclear weapons countries are members. And it's set forth in so-called customary international law, which for you and those of your audience who are involved to some extent in U.S. law and the common law, customary law is in a sense analogous to common law. It's not part of a statute or a convention and a multinational treaty necessarily, but it is a body of law that is broadly recognized by countries throughout the world, essentially all the countries of the world, broadly speaking. So that's what customary law is. The area of international law, including conventional law and customary international law, includes a number of principles, right? A bunch of rules and principles that are the rules that apply to the use of nuclear weapons as they apply, in fact, to the use of conventional weapons.
If you were to expound on what we consider to be customary international law, how international is what we assume to be customary international law? Oftentimes a criticism that comes from people in the third world and also the non-Western world is that a lot of things that are considered to be customary international law are written for by the winners, that is the West. So could you expand on this customary international law and how universal it is?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. The area or part of the fabric of international customary law that is relevant to our discussion today about is it lawful to use nuclear weapons or to threaten to use them? Is the policy of deterrence lawful or not? There are 5 or so central principles, and they're broadly recognized. I mean, there was, as you may recall, I know you're a student of this area and done a lot of work in it, there was an advisory case that the General Assembly of the United Nations took to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in the mid-90s, and the ICJ issued a decision on the topic, and the topic was the lawfulness of the threat and use of nuclear weapons. And at that series of hearings around that case, you had countries from around the world, and you had on the panel of judges from the ICJ, judges from the world's legal systems. So I think, Andrew, in answer to your question of how broad this is, I think these principles are broad and broadly accepted. And I don't think it would be a fair characterization to say that they are victors' rules that have been played out following a war. I think these are 4 very broadly recognized rules across the world's legal systems. And I think if you think it makes sense, I'd be glad to kind of walk us through what the 5 or 6 main principles are here. And then we could, if you think it makes sense, we could talk about individual ones of them. But I think it's worth just looking at, what are the rules, if that makes sense to you.
Could you walk me through those principles?
Yes, let me do that, and I really hope this will be helpful and indeed interesting for people. And first, let me name that the rule of distinction or discrimination, essentially synonymous terms. The rule of proportionality, the rule of necessity, the law as to reprisals, and the rule of precaution. So while one can expand the discussion, these are, to my study and observation, the primary rules that most fundamentally apply, no matter who you are, whether you're a lawyer within a nuclear weapons country in the law department, or you're a military person responsible for a state's nuclear weapons, or you're in an NGO, or you're at the UN in a disarmament agency, wherever you are, and if you're looking at the question, are nuclear weapons lawful, you're going to have to look at these rules.
So would you say they hail from Michael Walzer's just war theory and Thomas Aquinas? Are these the roots of these principles?
I think it's a good point, and it would be quite an interesting study to take any one of these rules back. But I take it as a general matter that they go back, and indeed, here's a point before we delve into what they are and what they mean. I take it to be the case, which sort of supports your inference that these go back very early in human intellectual history and theory about law and justice and right action and so forth. These rules are part of the New York Penal Code, where I live and where I'm admitted as a lawyer, but certainly throughout the United States, I think throughout the world. I'm obviously, not an expert on legal systems of all other countries of the world, but in my book, I had a group of students working with me on some of these principles who went through and found summaries of some of these principles in the law of legal systems throughout the world. But these 5 or so rules I've talked about are fundamental. I take it they would go back to Aquinas, and they would go back to the early intellectual leaders, in the West, but I would assume in the East and in all other legal systems, the same kind of rules are there in the criminal law and to some extent in the civil law. These rules are just plain fundamental rules. And let me just take a minute and walk through them, and then you can give me your sense, Andrew, of what makes sense in terms of whether to follow up on more detail on them. But the first of them, which has been called the grandfather of these rules, is the rule of distinction or discrimination. And it means that in war, but the same thing is true of a police officer under municipal law in the United States. A person lawfully using force is legally constrained to use it in a way that, you're distinguishing appropriate targets of the use of force. And so one should not, under international law, whether it's a conventional weapon or a nuclear weapon or a chemical and biological weapon, although they're in a somewhat different category now because there's a convention on the latter two, one needs to not use a weapon that can't distinguish a military target from a civilian target, or not use a weapon that is capable of distinguishing between those kinds of targets, not to use it in a way where it's in a circumstance where it can't distinguish. So in the use of force, the U.S., Russia, China, any country that has these weapons or has any kind of weapons is subject to this rule of distinction that it's unlawful to use weapons that can't distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate, lawful and unlawful targets. And it's unlawful to use even otherwise lawful weapons in a way or circumstance where they can't distinguish, right? So So that's the rule of distinction broadly. There's a rule of proportionality. Well, there's several of them, but the rule under law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law of proportionality is that the effects on the collateral effects on civilians and protected persons and objects shouldn't be disproportionate to the military value, right? You're going to strike a target in the reality of war, of armed conflict. It will happen that civilians will be in the way and you will harm civilians, but the rule of proportion, the rule of distinction says you have to use your weapon in a way to distinguish the lawful target. The rule of proportionality says, well, even though we know, and this stuff is not intended to be unrealistic. It's supposed to be realistic in difficult circumstances. Proportionality means that you can't use a weapon whose effects are going to disproportionately affect civilians and other protected persons and objects. So that rule of proportionality is a serious rule, and it applies here. The third of the central rules is the rule of necessity, and it says that while you can use weapons as necessary, as long as they comply with distinction and proportionality, to advance your interest in the war or the armed conflict, you can't use a level of force beyond that which you really need for the circumstance, right? If you can achieve your military objective in a particular instance through a lower level, a lower decibel level, that's not the right frame, but a lower level of force, one is supposed to do that within reason. So that's the rule of necessity. And we can talk about what these things mean, but that would mean, for instance, that if one could achieve one's military, if one were a nuclear weapons country, wouldn't even the other rules that would be applicable to the side? If one could achieve one's military objective through the use of conventional weapons, one should not use nuclear weapons because obviously they are at a much higher, level of extent of force and destructiveness and effects. So that, in a broad sense, I'm oversimplifying, is the rule of necessity. And then the rule of precaution is very broad, and it says that, well, we have these rules of armed conflict, and states, governments, the civilian leadership, the military leadership are supposed to comply with these rules, but obviously the government and military work through individuals, people like you and me and your audience, right? And so a government and a military have an obligation to take reasonable precautions in all aspects of their planning and implementation of the use of force and planning for it. It's required to take reasonable precautions to do it in a way that will comply with international law. So that's precaution. And then of the main rules, the one other one that I'll focus now is, as you mentioned earlier, Andrew, the law as to reprisal. And reprisals are an area of law where if one's adversary is violating the law, one has kind of a leave to violate the law oneself. But there are limits on that. It's supposed to be limited and effect. It's not supposed to be more than is needed in the occasion. It's not supposed to be disproportionate to what you're responding to. So, sorry, I've kind of gone on in a long monologue, and I wanted to have a discussion, but this is I think it's a good kind of summary introduction of points that are not controversial as to what these rules are that apply to nuclear weapons, and broadly speaking, what they mean.
From my understanding, it would be largely difficult for strategic nuclear weapons of the sort we saw being deployed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to fall under illegal use if we have these principles. But what about tactical nuclear weapons? How would you categorize that? Do you think there's a possibility we could use tactical nuclear weapons with low yield in a way that adheres to these principles?
Yes, you've put your finger, Andrew, on a central point, right? You're saying, you're sort of anticipating the point I was leading towards, that certainly as to higher yield nuclear weapons, as you say, it's hard to imagine how they can comply with these rules that I have described of distinction, proportionality, necessity, precaution, lawful reprisal, because their effects are so great. They can't distinguish. They're not controllable. So you can't know if you're thinking about, if you or I are the lawyer advising the military or the president or the civilian leadership, and, would it be lawful to use these weapons? Since the lawfulness turns on the effects of the use, and since these weapons are so uncontrollable that we can't know the effects, your point is I think absolutely correct, that it's essentially not possible. Although I have to say, we could talk about this. There are people who disagree with this now. People disagree with the conclusion that it's unlawful. It's just plain, clearly, I would say essentially per se unlawful to use high-yield nuclear weapons. So we can come back to that. That's an important area, and it is an area where the proponents and the critics of nuclear weapons as an instrument of national defense and warfare disagree, right? But your point about low yield is one that has to be addressed. First, a comment. The term low yield is not defined definitively by anybody. And actually, the yields of the weapons that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the range of 15 to 20, you'll see different kiloton estimates or numbers as to the level. Those would be regarded by some as low yield now, or certainly relatively low yield, because as you know, the kilotonnage, the extent of the destructiveness of a nuclear weapon is measured by its kilotonnage, the thousands of tons. And the typical nuclear weapons that we have in our arsenal, although we have dialer yield weapons that have a range of yields, but the typical yield is in the hundreds, 300, 350, 400 kilotons. There are megaton nuclear weapons, which are of even huger destructiveness, although the United States at this point doesn't, as I understand it, maintain any nuclear weapons in the megaton range. But going back to your point, Andrew, what about low yield? What about, 1 kiloton, 2 kiloton, 3, or even sub-kiloton, right? There are tactical nuclear weapons, which means, in a sense, low yield, although there are different definitions, but in a sense, low yield, that are even below a kiloton. And so there's different levels of answer to that. Firstly, the factual inference that's behind your point, which is a good one, is there a distinction here, is a correct factual inference that if you compare the effects of any one tactical nuclear weapon, which is, for instance, the concern we've had that Russia, that, Putin might use them in Ukraine this evening, right? It's not as if this isn't front of the news cycle now. It is the fact that these low-yield nuclear weapons, are lower yield, and their spread of effect is much less. And so, it's interesting. If one goes back to that case that I referred to, that the advisory opinion that was brought by the General Assembly of the UN to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in the mid-1990s, the defense by the United States of the lawfulness of nuclear weapons, because the U.S. was a nuclear weapons country with the U.K. and France and Russia and China and other nuclear weapons countries defending the lawfulness of their plans, their policies of deterrence. The defense the U.S. used, and I cover this in my book at some length because it's an important point, the defense was that, the critics are exaggerating the effect of the use of these weapons because we have low-yield weapons that we can deliver with precision to a target, and they'll have limited kilotonnage. They won't spread that much radiation, and they're not going to cause a lot of these effects of nuclear weapons that are potentially existential, right? I mean, a broad-scale war between the U.S. and Russia, there were authoritative estimates that were made. There was a big study that came out in August of 2022 that you could find, that your readers could find on the internet, where very qualified scientists from around the world spent an extensive amount of time, and they modeled the effects of a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia. And what did they find? They found that the number of deaths from such a war, get this, 5 billion people. I mean, that's most of the population of the world. So it's huge. So on your point, well, what about these tactical weapons, these low yield? Yes, they're lower yield. Yes, they're less destructive. Yes, they're not going to destroy the world or be existential, any one strike. But here is the fallacy, Andrew. To my thinking, here's the fallacy. And this is why when I received your invitation and knowing your podcast and that your audience is young folks in large measure like yourself in graduate school and in internships and with an interest in these areas, it's why I was so pleased to be able to have this discussion with you. Here's the fallacy. And frankly, this isn't me talking just from a personal perspective. I mean, I have several chapters in my book, which just came out in the last month, on this. And you and your audience can research this independently if you like. There is a huge body of literature out there that the use of low-yield nuclear weapons between nuclear powers has a high likelihood of escalation. So that's the point, I think, Andrew. When people who are defending the potential use of nuclear weapons by saying, it'll be low level, the risk is the escalation thing. And, it's not as if this exists in a vacuum, because under deterrence theory, we in the U.S., our military and civilian leadership in this area, have spent ever since the Cold War extraordinary efforts and initiative and time and expense trying to anticipate what the other side would do, and how you work deterrence. And there's a high level of awareness that the risk of the escalation, of going up the escalation ladder, is high, because each side would want to show resolve. And so maybe they'd go up a little bit. One side would use a kiloton in one of them, and the other side might use 2 1-kiloton bombs, or maybe but then the first guy would say, well, the second guy's doing this, and we'll go up. And yes, if they could keep it to, low yield, it would be horrible. I mean, if a low-yield nuclear weapons hit a major city in the world, I mean, it could destroy that city and huge numbers of people, right? But the risk to human life and humanity, the existential risk, is that there is this high likelihood of escalation, right? I mean that's the reality. So I think I'm going to stop and see what if you have a direction you'd like to see this going, but I think that's reality.
Before we go to the general principles about deterrence, when justifying the nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I don't know if it's a legal argument, but one point that proponents of the bombing often bring up is that if we never dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, more American troops would have died. Therefore, because we have stopped more American troops from dying and presumably more Japanese civilians from dying in a land invasion of Japan, it was justified for the United States to use nuclear weapons. This line of reasoning, and I'm not referring to the specific line of reasoning and the specific case, which is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but is there any provision in U.S. law and international law that addresses this possibility whereby if there's a large amount of risk to one's own troops, then the use of nuclear weapons is justified? I just wanted to hear your thoughts and insights on that matter.
I mean, I think you raise a good question. Isn't it the case that the present day strategic reality is totally different from what existed in 1945 at the end of the Second World War? It's just totally different. The U.S. was the only country that had these weapons. You didn't have that risk of escalation I was just talking about. You had a level of risk that, while horrendous, and I think the people who made the decision to use it knew that it was going to be a stupendous, a bomb in each case with stupendous effects. It wasn't what we face now, right? So I understand your question, and I've looked at your podcasts. I see you have numerous podcasts on interesting subjects across the area of foreign affairs, right? And so it's so interesting, and this is an interesting area, right? I mean, does deterrence protect our country, or if we were in Russia or China, would it protect our country from the perspective of those countries? And in a sense, I think this is the greatest threat. And in a way, if you ask me, what is a message that I would like to get through, having spent so many years writing this book, it is that we need, and really for you younger generation, right? Because I'm of the generation, I grew up during the Cold War, where we had an awareness. When I was in school, when I was in college, I mean, we had an awareness of the risk of using nuclear weapons. But other than yourself and people like you who are graduate students or interns or working in the field or in the Congress or in the government somewheres, the level of concern about these areas, to my perception, is not that great. It has receded from our consciousness because we've bought into the idea that, well, deterrence is a policy and it's a nice thing and it saves us from a lot of risk and a lot of death because we threaten, adversaries that don't do anything that is inimical to, that injures our interests, or will come back with a huge, extremely destructive response. And so it sounds like a good bargain, right? But what's that term that we all learned when we were in college about Faustian bargains? It's an unfortunate, it's a failure of imagination to buy that rationale, because deterrence is not a theory. It is a readiness. It is an acquisition of billions of dollars. I mean, I have the numbers up here on my screen somewhere from the book of, over a 10-year period, which we're in maybe the third year of now. The estimate from the Congressional Budget Office was something like $780 billion for nuclear weapons. It's a huge amount of money. It's a huge expenditure of human personnel and training, to be ready to use these weapons. And the answer to your question of, saving time and saving life by using these weapons, we have a lot of our weapons on high alert levels, right? And the Russians have it as well. Ironically, by the way, China doesn't. China has what I would say, or has had for years, predominantly, what I would call a much more enlightened policy, where and this is something, that you and your, and people, younger generation might want to think about, right? Because you all are going to have influence. You have influence now with the government and with the legislature and with the people in the agencies. What China does is they separate out the nuclear warhead from the delivery vehicle, and they don't have things on high alert levels. But as long as you have this high alert level, Andrew, I don't think your premise, that you were asking me about from the Second World War perspective, I don't think that's how it works today, that, we're going to save people's life or anybody by using these weapons. I mean, we're going to risk getting much more horrible repercussions. But let me mention one thing, Andrew, that for you and for your generation, right? Many of you, as from talking with you earlier, many of you all are in graduate school or in law school, and you're interested in international affairs, international law, international relations. And I've taught it, as you said, at Fordham Law School for years. Students and professors alike are looking for areas to write in where you can make a difference, where you can have an actual impact. It's not just some theoretical thing that's another article and nobody will ever read or care about it. There are, in this area that I've written about in my book, it's an area that, frankly, is not, it hasn't gotten much attention in the literature, right? If you Google nuclear weapons, you'll get untold, probably millions of hits, right? But if you hit the legal piece, you're not going to find much. You may find me in there a couple hundred times and some of the people I work with, but I mean, there's just a handful of us. It hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. And for your generation, I believe there is an extraordinary opportunity to write stuff and develop the law. I did with a number of others, I organized a conference at the end of 2023 on this field of nuclear weapons and international law. And the proceedings of it were published by the Georgetown Journal of International Law at the law school. And you all can find it if you Google it. They did a special edition that came out about 2 months ago, which was the proceedings of the conference. And as part of that, or I could send it to you if you wanted to share it with your readers, I prepared a list of issues that I prepared for the faculty of the conference, and then we talked about them in the conference. And my kind of invitation to you and your colleagues and to the younger generation, take this list and take it to the next level, figure out your analysis of the answer to these questions, which are questions that have not been much addressed. In my book that just came out, I mean, any number of these issues that I address, I hate to say it, I mean, I was just one of the first people to address them. And I'm not saying, somebody else will judge whether I did it well or not well, right? I mean, not for me. But the issues, unquestionably, are very central issues. And I think it's, what's that expression? There are a lot of very juicy issues to be looked at in IR and IL around nuclear weapons threat and use.
If you were to suggest some policy recommendations and maybe point out to any loopholes that exist or any issues that exist in current laws about nuclear weapons for the future generations to fix, what areas would you highlight as the main areas that need new laws, new policies, new legislation, or loophole fixing measures to be implemented in?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the main area that I need to work on with people I know and you and your generation needs to work on is the policy of deterrence. Because the U.S. and Russia are making, in my judgment, a significant failure of strategic thinking by having these weapons on a high alert level with very short time for decision making and with obvious technological issues as to potential human and equipment failure, particularly as AI inevitably kicks in. So we've created a situation that is very risky, and we should step back from it. Not, while one can say, and you were talking about Thomistic thinking and just war, yes, we should think for reasons of justice and human potential to do the right thing. But I'll take the discussion to the next level. We should think because of human survival. Whether we're a patriot in one country or another, or however, we think about these things, it is unquestionable that there is a huge risk to human life and survival because of the high alert level and the thousands of these weapons we have ready to go and the potential for events lurching out of control, which, as you know, historically, you were talking about World War I, and we were talking earlier about World War I and World War II. It's a risk. So I hope this comment is helpful, Andrew. My answer to your question is that my suggestion would be to focus on the risk of our current policies and on, if not doing the right thing, at a minimum, surviving, which I think gives us a basis to communicate with people in other countries, even countries adversary with us now. Because, unlike terrorists, who it's impossible to, one would think, to deter a terrorist, because a terrorist may want to die, right, and want to be a martyr. But government leaders, country leaders, I mean, you could have irrational leaders, and that's a risk at times, right? But countries want to survive. So my broadest, I guess, suggestion in answer to your question of what is the main thing I'd suggest is work on awareness of understanding how out of reasonable proportion we've let the risks become, and start communicating with people from other cultures and countries to work on survival tactics to just lessen the risks. And I know you're a big, you're studying IR, and I'm sure you've had any number of courses, very interesting ones, I can imagine, at GW, on what is one's theory of international relations, right? And one theory, of course, is hegemony, that we want to be stronger than our adversary. But a theory that I think the U.S. and the Soviet Union had reached by the end of the Cold War was a sense that the strategic milieu that made sense was one of mutual security, that my country is safe if my adversary feels that they're safe and don't feel a need for, the high alert levels and the quick reactions, and if we're able to communicate. So I think mutual security, I don't know if that's what you're hearing in graduate school now. I'd be interested in that, Andrew, but I think we need to get back to that, and it's not where we are, I don't believe.
What would you say has been a cause of failure in the current non-proliferation regime? Is it the fact that the non-proliferation regime we have in question did not account for a multipolar world where countries that are not the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States or China have slowly begun to obtain nuclear weapons? Or is there something that we have done wrong in coming up with the global non-proliferation regime that it has led to countries like Iran and North Korea, despite best efforts from Washington and other countries, to stop them obtaining nuclear weapons?
Again, we could have a couple of books on this, right? A couple of volumes. It's a good point. I think that, well, starting with Russia, obviously people disagree on this, right? But after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had a choice. And there were even discussions then, should we bring Russia into NATO? But the nature of the relationship was an open question. But the approach that we took in the U.S., and it's a big historical debate. Was this a huge mistake? But we moved NATO more and more to the east and closer and closer to Russia. Now, would we have the current aggressiveness of Russia if we hadn't done that? Would it have happened anyhow? Would Russia, because of a sense of, a Russophile thing, have wanted to regain the Soviet Union and the empire? I mean, that's a debatable question, right? And I'm not the expert on that, but I mean, I know that's an issue. But to my judgment, we made a mistake in pushing ever closer to Russia's borders and making it harder, because we had an arms control regime, obviously, throughout the Cold War. And then at the end of the Cold War, we made great progress. We took the weapons down. We did it under Republican and Democratic administrations. We took the weapons down, and we made a lot of progress for a while. But then in recent years, arms control has been dead, and it's going to be hard to negotiate anything with Russia, I think, although I wouldn't give up and say it's impossible until the Ukraine situation is resolved, and hopefully in a way that doesn't, exacerbate. But in the fullness of time, there will be opportunity for arms control again, and that's what we had during the Cold War. What I advocate for, on a multilateral basis, I'm not talking unilaterally, but working out of this sense of survival towards extensive arms control and ultimately abolition, on the sense that the weapons are too risky. They too much take war beyond just a battle between two countries to threaten the whole world, really. So the objective should be abolition. Very hard, and I don't want to be unrealistic here. But to answer your question, I think the failure has been that things got out of control. Now, what happened with Iran, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we went into Iraq, and with hindsight, I mean, that was a horrendous blunder, and the George W. Bush administration did not have the basis for it that we were told, and everybody and most of the Senate believed, and the leadership, including the top leadership on both sides of the aisle, believed we had, So if you're a nuclear weapons country, it's not irrational to believe, or if you're a country thinking of getting nuclear weapons, it's not irrational to think, well, I'll be safer if I have them. It's asymmetrical power. So I think that's the problem, and the answer to it is, it's complex and it's a whole discussion. But it's something we all need to be working on. And your generation, I don't know if you can count on, my generation, your parents' generation resolving it. I think you all have to figure out, and be working on the answers and be ready for answers yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Charles Moxley, author of the book Nuclear Weapons and International Law, Existential Risks of Nuclear War and Deterrence Through a Legal Lens, Volumes 1-2. Charles Moxley, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your and your following on your podcast. Wonderful podcast.
Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose is an initiative of Andrew Jose Media. The views expressed by guests on this show do not necessarily represent the official positions and opinions of Andrew Jose, Andrew Jose Media, and Strategic Wisdom.
Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using to listen to this show in order to not miss out any future interviews and conversations that Andrew Jose will bring to you on this podcast. We're streaming on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Yandex, JioSaavn, Amazon Music, and many other podcast streaming services. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com and to follow Strategic Wisdom on Twitter and Instagram at StratWisdom. Do support our work by buying from our merch store. For more details, visit strategicwisdom.substack.com.